All right. I think we're gonna. We're good here, right? I think we're gonna get started. I'm Teddy Downey, the CEO and executive editor at the Capitol Forum, and we've got a great lineup and a great featured speaker today. So who I'll introduce momentarily, but wanted to make really quick introductory remarks to kick things off. First, I really wanted to thank the reporters on our team who have worked really diligently on postal issues for the past couple of years here at the Capitol Forum. We got Vikas Kumar and Mike Williams. So let's give them a round of applause. They've been doing really good work. And for business reporters, covering the Postal Service is extremely hard work. The Postal Service very rarely makes decision makers available for interviews. FOIA requests are routinely denied, citing blanket commercial exemptions. The Board of Governors are not in place yet, so you don't have political, actors who can interact with the public. And all this means that the investigative work by Vikas and Mike is really all the more admirable. Next, I want to talk about the focus of this conference, and it's to better understand these business deals that are negotiated behind closed doors at the Postal Service, and to better understand how the details of those deals shape important markets in the U.S. Economy, in the global economy now, including the e-commerce industry. Beyond that, we're interested in asking really tough questions. We're not interested in some of these, questions that you hear answered sort of in the press, mainstream press about, well, is this deal legal technically, or, we want to know, are these deals in the public interest? Are these deals good for the American people? Because that's the standard that the Postal Service has. And I'm going to quote from a November 2016 Postal Service OIG report titled "Governance of the U.S. Postal Service." And there's a section in the conclusion of that report that describes why it's so hard to assess whether or not USPS decisions are in the public interest. And here's the quote. The Board of Governors, and I think the Board of Governors stands for the whole USPS here, but the Board of Governors faces a wide range of challenges, including a fundamental mismatch between its significant responsibility and limited authority, a crowded field of stakeholders, and profound changes to the Postal Service's business environment. Governors must weigh all of these issues and determine what course of action best represents the public interest. The report goes on to describe the heart of the issues around transparency. And here's the rest of the quote. The Postal Service functions in a politicized and public environment, and few of its actions will meet with the approval of all its stakeholders. As is standard practice in the corporate governance world, the governors rarely debate controversial topics or discuss strategic issues in public meetings. Unfortunately, this can make it difficult for the public to see how the governors are exercising their authority. And we're here today to shed light on the key debates and the questions that are confronting the USPS right now and that are being looked at by the President's task force. The last point I want to make is that having worked on this for the past few years, I'm amazed at how many people in sort of the policy community think that this public interest question is a really easy one to answer. And the answer is, well, we just need to focus on what's the lowest price for the end customer, and more often than not, they're talking about end customers in cities, or so consumer low prices, particularly where there are a lot of people in major cities. And today we'll hear from small businesses, big businesses, labor, and other stakeholders to understand how USPS should define and understand how to make decisions that are in the public interest. And so with that, I'd love to introduce Lori Rectanus from the GAO. She's a director of GAO's physical infrastructure team, overseeing GAO's audit portfolio for postal issues, federal fleet management, currency and coin production, and federal building security. Since joining GAO, she has brought much needed focus on the programmatic and human capital management of critical federal operations. And she's in charge of the GAO's portfolio on USPS's efforts to ensure its viability and accomplish its mission. And she's just an incredible resource in terms of knowing the law and all the policies at the USPS. And please give her a warm welcome.
Thank you, Teddy. Hello, everyone. I always, as I say to those of you who I've worked with, I always feel a little bit intimidated. I joke that when I've been a GAO a really long time, and in the 1980s, I did work on Postal Service, and then I went off and I did different things, and then about 5 years ago, I was put back into the Postal Service, and it's amazing some of the same people who are still around doing this work. So I give you all very much credit for hanging in there and dealing with what I agree with Teddy is a very difficult topic. And every time I think I figured it out, something else happens. But I know you all are experts, and I look around the room and I see all of you who help us so much in the work that we do. And again, I always have to be careful because I'm not telling you what you don't know, but I think what I am maybe providing is a perspective of what I see when I've spoken to all of you. You all know since 2009, the Postal Service's financial condition has been on GAO's high-risk list. This is a list of government programs that we think are subject to fraud, waste, or mismanagement, and that we think that the executive branch, and in this case, the president should really Congress should pay attention to. Again, I want to reiterate that we're not saying the Postal Service is subject to fraud, waste, or mismanagement, but particularly their solvency. And that's driven by what we argue is a business model that isn't sustainable anymore, and these unfunded liabilities that continue to grow. Last year, they were about 200% of Postal Service's annual revenue. So I'm really psyched about being here today to kick this off. I know that the conversation today is really going to focus a lot on Postal Service's role in sort of the package sphere, but I think it's always helpful to kind of reground or, ground ourselves sort of in the history of what brought us here a little bit, and maybe some of the reasons why we can't seem to move as much forward as I know many of us would like to. So the disclaimer I always give at this point in time, in case anyone hears my comments and wonders where GAO is headed, our goal at GAO as auditors, as policy analysts, we want to see good policy, good government. We want to see organizations operating efficiently and effectively. We don't have a particular view on what that would look like, but we want to make sure that if there is a federal entity that's providing services, that they use their dollars well. So to start off, I want to read a little something to you, and some of you might even know where this came from. I'll quiz you later, and I'll see. So I find the statement really intriguing. A commercially and financially viable postal service remains vital to the American economy, but the future role of the Postal Service is uncertain. For any organization to remain viable and flourish, it must change. As technology, commerce, and society evolve, so too must government and corporate business models. This is no less true for the Postal Service than for any other enterprise. However, the institutional model adopted in 1970 was not designed to cope with the fundamental changes that are today reshaping the delivery services marketplace. These trends include changing customer needs, eroding mail volumes, rising costs, fixed costs resulting from USO, increase in global networks, and increasing security concerns. We need to reach a national decision on the future of the U.S. Postal Service. Anybody know where that came from? Okay, I'll tell you in a minute. It could have come from a lot of different places, right? But so I find the statement intriguing for a couple reasons. One is I think it says things that all of us at a high level pretty much agree with, right? The world is changing. The Postal Service as a structure is maybe not in the best position to address those changes. The bread and butter mail volume is going down. And that's really what was supposed to create this model, that bread and butter mail volume was supposed to pay for how much it costs to deliver that. But that's not happening. Packages, which we'll talk about a lot today, I like to call packages a frenemy to the Postal Service. They are growing at a time that the other mail volume is potentially going down. They're a pretty small portion of the volume, and yet they're increasingly becoming a key revenue source. But they're more expensive to handle. And they're very dynamic, and they're very competitive. And so Postal Service is in a catch-22, right? They need to invest. They need to create the infrastructure. They need to do what they can to grow that market. On the other hand, they fully recognize that that market could be pulled out from them. And in fact, some of you may know, over the past couple of years, the package growth has been in double digits. This year, the Postal Service is projecting a much smaller growth in packages. So even that, they recognize that this market is becoming almost more competitive than they can handle. And what's going to happen if and when that package market pulls out from the Postal Service? Oh, I'm out of space here. So for that reason, a lot of operational costs, GAO's talked about a lot, they continue to go up. And this is primarily because the infrastructure that the Postal Service has continues to stay relatively the same while their revenue is flatlining or going down in some locations. Big numbers, 500,000 retirees, 600,000 workers, and that number is growing, including career workforce. When you're spreading out consistent or increasing infrastructure costs over a declining volume or a changing volume, that does not bode well. And then the USO, I look forward to if folks have conversations about that today. Do we even know what the USO should be today or in the future? I think we all think about younger people that we know. We think about what is the mailbox going to look like in the future? What kind of frequency of mail and type of mail do people want in the future? And so we don't know if that's still in the future what it should be now. I think it's ironic that the USO is sort of the pinnacle or the benchmark of what the Postal Service provides, and yet because of the declining volume, the USO is kind of what's contributing to the problem. So the bottom line here, and GAO has said it and other people have said it, is this business model that theoretically is supposed to make the Postal Service self-sustaining is not, in fact, working. And so this concept of self-sustaining, I think what GAO would like to start saying more is we have to even get rid of that in our heads, because essentially what's happened is because of the non-payment for the retiree health benefits and this past year FERS and CSRS, the government has essentially been given Postal Service a $40 billion loan, tax-free. And you can argue, you can say, Postal Service made the best decisions it could, given its business model, but it's really not a business. Not just because it's not self-sustaining, but it doesn't have the flexibility to do what it needs to do to respond to changing conditions. GAO would also argue, even if you took the retiree health benefits out of the picture, that would save them, at this point, $62 billion of their unfunded liabilities, but that still leaves them with close to $100 billion in unfunded liabilities. And the level of effort they'd have to take to achieve that, it's just not possible, given their current model. So the other intriguing part about this statement is that it actually came from the Postal Service's transformation plan in 2002, which some of you were probably here for that, right? And so I think what it shows is for many, many years, we've been having these same issues. We've been talking about the future. We've been talking about the model that may not be working. Now, Paella came in and addressed some of these things, and even that's been a decade. And so as I've looked around and I've talked to lots of stakeholders, and, GAO has done its work, it seems to me there are three key reasons why we continue to have these conversations and we can't seem to move too many things forward. The first one is that we cannot decide whether postal services are a fundamental right that everybody should get, or they simply a service that should be left to the market. How do we treat these compared to how we treat other public, other utilities, things like telecom, things like water, things like electricity? Are they really an infrastructure? I thought it was interesting that the president issued his infrastructure plan and postal services were not even in there. And I thought that was interesting because many would argue postal is an infrastructure that, as we said, is supposed to bind the nation together. The second thing I see a lot of disagreement about is, should they be a business or should they be a federal entity? Right now, the idea was that they're a little of both, and I would argue that they probably have the worst of both worlds rather than the best of both worlds. If they're a business, then we need to be okay with them making decisions that might affect workers, that might affect their infrastructure, that might affect their customers if they need to adapt to a changing market. Are we okay with them doing that? If they're a federal entity, are we okay with them doing things in the private sphere? We'll talk about that today. Or should they stay in their own lane and only do those things that, quote unquote, the private sector doesn't want to do? And if that's the case, if we feel like that's important, how do we want to pay for that? A lot of what you hear about from folks is that they think Postal has a social role, that they should be involved in local communities. They should help use their infrastructure to support local communities or do other services, such as banking. But is that what we want? So I think that's the second question. And then the third one that ultimately I always ask, because I get to ask it, I'm an auditor, I always try to start with the end goal. And my question would be, what does success look like? And I see sort of three different views. The first view is, I want a healthy postal service. And I interpret that as, we want to continue this organization the way it is. We want it financially stable. We want it performing well. We want it thriving and vital. And, we talk a lot about the history of the Postal Service, in those local communities, binding the nation together. Those are the people who say, if we're going down those roads 6 days a week, and if mail volume declines, then we need to find some other things for those postal folks to do so that we could take advantage of that infrastructure. On the other hand, I also hear people say, the goal, success, is a healthy postal ecosystem that promotes national performance and global competitiveness. That's what we want. And that is more important than the performance of an individual entity within that, right? Those are the folks who would say, well, you know what? If we don't need to go down that road 6 days a week, maybe we just call it like it is and think of a different paradigm. Or maybe it shouldn't be the Postal Service going down that road 6 days a week. Maybe it should be other people, because there might be other people who can do it better, faster, cheaper, whatever. And then finally, the elephant in the room is there are many people who judge success as the status quo. We don't want to change anything, because if you start to change things, then the current situation that we have could be endangered. And again, I think we see that in some of our congressional representatives who the danger of taking action is sometimes greater than the danger of kicking the can down the road. So, but because we can't agree on these facts, what I have seen and sort of the thing that I've been talking more and more about is I'm seeing what I'm calling swirling. We all get together and we talk about the problems, but we're all coming at it from a different viewpoint, and we can't seem to find a place to swirl, to settle in. We've got the Postal Service robbing Peter to pay Paul, right? They're making decisions because they don't have the flexibility they need, because they are fearful of declining service. They've been working really hard to get their service back. They don't want to come back on the workforce. In fact, they're growing their workforce. They're making decisions to put their money in that area compared to paying their unfunded liabilities. And the reality is, Congress has let them do it since 2010. Again, $40 billion they haven't paid, and Congress hasn't said a word about it. So if I were Postal Service, I might have been doing the same thing. The downside of that is they also haven't taken a lot of significant cost reductions. They haven't, really changed their infrastructure very much. They haven't capitalized on some efficiencies. GAO is on record as kind of saying, there's some cost savings there you could take that you're not. But they don't feel like they can do that. And quite honestly, they're not sure that there's a payoff for them to do that. Now, where that hits a rub is they're also, you all are well aware of the PRC proposals to raise prices. Mailers, what I hear them saying, well, why should we pay more in prices when we're not sure the Postal Service is taking the cost reductions we think they should? So you have this argument back and forth. You have unions. You have the workers who are saying, you know what, we're working really hard to get that mail out there, and we're trying to, achieve service. We deserve to get paid more money, right? And in fact, the Postal Service has continued to negotiate pay increases with its workers, to the tune of about $1 billion at least in additional costs each year. You guys know that compensation is about 50% of their operational costs. But is Postal Service going to start arguing with its workers now when it says that service is paramount? We talk a lot about the last mile, right? We talk a lot about that is the value of the Postal Service. That is the value that they serve. But then we say, but you know what? It's too expensive. Or it's not nimble. It's not agile. We need it differently. So again, what are we wanting from that? And then finally, going back to my client, the Congress. I've had some staffers say to me, help me understand this, GAO. We're the Chicken Little, right? We've been saying since 2009, this is urgent. This is urgent. And they're like, hello, here it is, 9 years later. Their point is, well, you know what? People are getting paid. The mail is getting delivered. And I mean, we can argue that the standard, that the service may not be what we want, but it's pretty good. It's reliable. It's dependable. And in some cases, mailers and postal service are coming up with these amazing innovations. And so I've had staff say to me, what is the problem? Really? Like, is there really a problem that would dictate that we take action right now? But what I would argue is there is a problem, and the problem is that, one, refusing to look at alternatives and different ways of operating, it means bad stuff's going to happen anyway, and in fact, it's already happening. We did some work in 2017 where we looked at what could be some of the effects of eliminating or narrowing the letter or the mailbox monopoly. And, we had a lot of people say, yeah, there would be an impact on the Postal Service. Revenue, volume, maybe efficiency if you lose your economies of scope and scale, maybe some safety issues if you let anybody in the mailbox. And where it divided at that point is some people said, okay, so don't even think about that. Don't even think about changing the monopolies. But then other people said, but look, that's happening anyway now. We're already losing volume. If we raise prices, we're going to maybe lose even more volume. In terms of economies and scale and scope, we're already losing that because mail volume is going down. And you've probably noticed Postal's total factor productivity has actually been kind of going in the wrong direction the last couple of years. And in terms of, again, security and safety of mailboxes, again, if you think 5 years, 10 years from now, what is a mailbox even going to look like? Where are people going to get their mail? How much of what we're going to get in the future, if it's packages, how much of that's going to go in the mailbox anyway, right? So the other issue we looked at last year was the international mailing, the terminal dues. And we might get into some of that today as well. We were asked to look at, the changes that were agreed to in the last UPU Congress that went into effect this year as to, like, what's it going to mean for this international mailing environment? And when we got into it, we identified who we thought might be the winners and losers from, as it increased some of the prices, created the two categories, documents and goods. And so, we kind of reported, the good news story here is that because of the increase in prices, the Postal Service is now reporting that for incoming mail, which we're talking, primarily e-packets and packages, they're going to be made more whole. And also with the increase in prices, it stands to reason that the folks who compete with the Postal Service should be able to compete a little bit better because the prices are higher. But when we spoke to some of those competitors, they were like, this wasn't even enough. It wasn't enough to really make things more competitive. We still feel like the prices are unfair. We can't really get in there. When we spoke with the businesses, American businesses, well, are you happy that these prices are increased now? Because now you might be able to compete better with a manufacturer in China. And they were the same. They were like, no, these prices are not enough that it makes a difference. But the American consumer, potentially either way, they're going to now pay more for their international, either outbound or inbound, because the prices went up. And so when we start to talk about, was this a good thing? Was it a bad thing? Again, it comes back to the swirling of everybody has a different definition of what success looks like. For the State Department, I think their goal here is that it's the UPU helps ensure, stable, efficient, international mailings, so we know how to charge each other, we know who's going to carry our mail, and we have some assurance that it's going to get delivered. For the Postal Service, their goal is we want to be whole, right? We don't want to be losing money on international items. For American businesses, they want to be competitive, and for the express consignment folks, they want to be able to be competitive. But then the American consumer is about that American consumer. Should they be able to get the best deal possible? Which means maybe they should be able to get things from China if it's cheaper. So again, all that to say that the more work we do, the more difficult it is for GAO to come out and say, are things good or not, because it depends upon who the stakeholder is. And I would argue that this swirling or this fear of the future is actually going to run into what I would call a real crisis. We're doing some work right now where we're looking at the Retiree Health Benefit Fund. We're doing some projections with OPM as to when that fund might run out of money. And I can tell you that it's not a function of if, it's a function of when, particularly if the Postal Service continues to not pay. It's about $62 billion unfunded right now, so it's about 60% unfunded. And there really isn't any clarity of what would happen when that fund runs out of money and Postal can't make the payments on a pay-as-you-go basis. We're actually working with our clients right now to sort of say, like, should there be a little bit more clarity about what might happen? We've identified what states and locals and some companies are doing to address this, because fundamentally you have two choices. You either reduce the benefit or you put more money into it. Those are your only choices. And at some point, someone's going to have to make a call there about what we want to do. What happens when package mailers pull out of the system? What is Postal going to do with either the infrastructure they've bought or the remaining volume that they have? And then if and when this means revenue and volume decline, at what point is Postal going to have to dip into this liquidity that they have been trying so hard to amass? You know, they're up to about $10 billion now, and they've said, they were very honest when they told Congress they weren't going to make their payments this year. They said, we need money for liquidity. We need to invest finally in our capital. And yeah, we're not going to pay CSRS FERS or RHB. We're putting the money into our bank account. But at some point, that $10 billion might have to be used to pay employees or to, you know, pay the electricity bill. So how long before that happens? So real quickly, I mean, we all know that there's other things that people have been trying to do, what I call tweaks to the current infrastructure. You know, we all know about the PRC proposal to raise prices. We know about the legislation that's got the Medicare integration piece. We know that, you know, many of us think there are things Postal can do to reduce its costs, reduce capacity. And in that respect, I'll talk just very briefly about some work we did looking at Parcel Select NSAs, which I know we're going to talk about today. You know, to be fair, the Postal Service doesn't have a lot of places where it can really generate revenue. And NSAs are a great opportunity to generate revenue. But again, I would ask the question of what is the goal? In our work that we did on Parcel Select NSAs, we did not look at how they priced them, but we did look at the methods they used to develop costs. And we made some recommendations in ways that we felt the Postal Service should be more precise about how it develops costs for contracts, being more like the private sector competitors to really calculate what the implication of size and weight is on what these contracts cost. And at that time, Postal was also using an average cost for all the contracts rather than do contract-specific pricing. Now, we know that they're starting to respond to us a bit, and they're doing some additional data collection to get some better data. But again, the question that I would ask, and I look forward to the conversation today, is obviously they have to cover costs. You know, they have to meet the legal requirements. But how much is too much? How much is not enough? At what point is it unfair competition? The very fact that Postal Service is identifying that the package market is going to grow faster than their share of it will kind of indicates to me that there's still a bunch of competition out there. So I look forward to hearing about that. I think, you know, I talked about the potential impact of the price increase. If that went forward and mailers decrease the volume of mail that they are mailing, which they are saying, you know, there could be real implications there. And then the Medicare integration, I think, in my personal opinion, I think that's what's been holding up the legislation more than anything else. There was a recent report out. I don't know if you guys saw it, but it said last week, it said Medicare is going to go belly up in 2028. So, you know, what does that mean if we flip all the postal folks over to Medicare? And an overwhelming majority of retirees use Medicare now anyway. But if we put everybody over to Medicare, and then that needs a bailout, you know, so is that really the answer as well? And again, at the end of that, even if that helped Postal Service with some of its liabilities, I think the biggest message the GAO has is that is not the answer to the business model. The business model is still where you have operational costs growing faster than revenue. I don't think any private sector entity could operate when you have liabilities that are more than your yearly revenue. So what do we need to do now, this year, soon, so that in 15 years we're not having this conversation again. We've called on Congress to decide with the services that we need, how we want to pay for them, and the role that we want the Postal Service to play. And the more and more I do this work, I really believe that what we need is a fundamental reboot. To tweak the current infrastructure doesn't really help us address the fundamental problems. But I fully recognize in saying that that's really hard, because it not only affects people's businesses and their pockets, but I think when you're in this world and you've grown up in this world, that's all you know. This paradigm is all you know. And I tell a story. When we were doing our monopoly work, I posited this to a particular person, and I said, well, let's think through, like, what would happen if the Postal Service only delivered mail twice a week? And without a beat, this person responded and said, well, who would do it the other 4 days? Right? And again, I say that not to malign this person, but to say their paradigm was so connected to 6-day-a-week delivery. They couldn't even fathom a world that wouldn't have 6-day-a-week delivery. And so I say that to say that it's really hard to ask someone who's lived in this world, who this is the paradigm that they know, to really think outside of the proverbial box, or the mailbox, if you will. Which is why I'm also really curious to see what the task force comes up with, because when you have people running this task force who are the Department of Treasury and OPM and OMB and government types, I know they're maybe newer in the government, can they really think about the long-term vision? But in the absence of clarity about the Postal Service's role and the flexibility to serve that role, the best we're ever going to do is muddle through. And at some point, I mean, I would argue now muddling through is not good enough. And at some point, the tsunami will be on us, and we'll all be sitting here going, we knew it was coming. We just couldn't figure it out. So today, when we're talking about NSAs and last mile costs and business model, I really hope that, we can think about, like, what do we want from our delivery system and the role that the Postal Service should play compared to others. And I would love to see some forward-thinking dialogue about the right vision for this ecosystem and the steps we need to take to achieve it. So thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I will turn it over to the panelists, and I look forward to a great discussion. Thank you, guys.